Today I want to share with you a hamburger soup recipe with homemade hamburger bun croutons. This is an easy one-pot meal that's very budget friendly because it's flexible and allows you to use what you already have on hand. Plus, if you need to stretch this to feed a crowd, I'm going to show you how. It's easy to do. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nutrient-dense foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning about those things, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. You're going to find this hamburger soup recipe very easy to make, and it comes together quickly so that you can have this on the table in no time at all. Now, the first thing I want to mention is if you open the description underneath this video, you'll see the timestamps for everything that I'm going to cover. So this way, if at any time you want to jump ahead, it's easy for you to do. And also in the description will be a link to the printable recipe over on my website, Mary's Nest. Now, the first thing that you're going to need is 1 pound of ground beef. Now, the ground beef I have here is grass-fed and grass-finished. Now, the reason I stress grass-finished is because if cattle is raised on grass, that's wonderful. But if they're finished on grass, that's all the better. Cattle that's raised on grass has a very high CLA content. And CLA stands for, and excuse my pronunciation, conjugated linoleic acid, something like that. And it's normally referred to as CLA. And it's something that's very nutritious for us to be able to consume. Now, if you saw one of my previous videos where I showed you how to make sloppy joes, I went into a rather detailed discussion about CLA. So if you want to catch up on that, definitely go watch the first part of that video. But getting back to the CLA here, the reason grass-finished is important is because that allows the CLA to stay at a nice high level. When cattle are finished with other crops to kind of fatten them up, like corn, unfortunately that decreases the level of CLA in their fat. Now, if you're new to traditional foods, please don't worry about this. If you're just at the beginning of your journey where you're trying to remove a lot of processed and prepackaged foods from your kitchen and move more to a traditional foods kitchen where you make things more homemade, you may not be at the point in your budget where you're buying grass-fed or grass-finished beef, and that is okay. The longer you're with me, the more you'll hear me say that the most important thing when you're on this journey is to stay in your budget. Do not allow yourself to become stressed and feel you need to be perfect and have every single food be perfect. Take your time on this journey, and little by little, as you buy less processed and prepackaged foods, you can move monies in your grocery budget around to allow you to buy better food. And also remember to always check with your farmer's market, or if you live in an area where there are ranchers, check with them as well, because that's where you may be able to get your best buys on meat. And often at farmers markets or buying directly from ranchers, you can get a very good quality of meat. And if you ever wind up buying meat or bones or chicken feet or things like that online, be sure to check the description underneath this video where I have a coupon code. I believe it's for 15% off if you buy your meats or chickens, so on and so forth, from US Wellness Meats. So that's a nice little savings. Also, if you are at the beginning of your traditional foods journey and you're just maybe starting to try and incorporate little bits of organ meats into your diet, like liver or heart or kidneys, this is a great recipe to do that, just like the Sloppy Joe's recipe was a great place to do that as well. Whenever you're cooking anything with ground beef and it's got some spices and nice flavors, that can be a particularly good recipe to start adding in little bits of organ meats. And you can start with something as small as a little bit of chopped beef liver or a little bit of chopped beef heart or beef kidneys. And literally when I say a little bit, I mean you can start with a tablespoon, no one's going to notice the flavor, and then little by little maybe you can work up to about 1/4 cup in addition to whatever ground beef you have. Now you can see why I like to put timestamps in my videos, because I always like to take a little time in the beginning to talk to those of you who are new to traditional foods and discuss the little details about grass-fed, grass-finished beef, and so on and so forth. And one more tip that I want to share before we get cooking, and this might be especially helpful for beginners, is that online beef sellers like US Wellness Meats, and I'm sure other companies that sell online as well, will sell ground beef that's already been mixed with some of the organ meats. So that can be very helpful. Now, eating organ meats is becoming actually a little more popular as the traditional foods movement becomes more popular. Just the way bone broth exploded, now organ meats are becoming of more interest to people, and they're looking for ways to prepare them so as to be able to, easily ease them into their diet and into their family's diet little by little. So you may want to check with your grocery store and ask them if they would be willing to carry some chopped meat that's already mixed with organ meats. But definitely look for this at farmers markets, as well as speaking to local ranchers in your area, if you live in an area where there are ranches. Now, to make this soup, which serves 8, you're going to want to get a nice big soup pot. Now, what I'm going to do is take about a half a teaspoon of baking soda, and I'm just going to sprinkle this over the ground beef. And then I'm just going to take my spoon here. It's a spoonula, it's like a spatula spoon. And I'm just going to mix up the ground beef and the baking soda. You can certainly do this with clean hands as well. Now, the reason that we're adding a little bit of baking soda to our ground beef, and sometimes I might say chopped meat, that's kind of old-fashioned. That's what my mom always called it. But whatever you call it, whether it's ground beef or chopped meat, it's one and the same. And the reason that we're adding the baking soda to this is that baking soda helps keep chopped meat moist and tender. And that's very important whenever you're making something like a hamburger soup, or like the sloppy joes that we made previously, or like a chili, because there's nothing worse than biting into, especially in a hamburger soup, because I'll show you the consistency in terms of the size of the pieces of ground beef that we want to keep this at. There's nothing worse than biting into a piece of ground beef that's rubbery, and the baking soda will really help prevent that. And you don't need a lot for this particular recipe. You just need about a half a teaspoon, and that's plenty. Now, to our soup pot, I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of butter and 1 tablespoon of olive oil. If you want to just use olive oil, you can definitely do that. If you'd rather use ghee, which is basically clarified butter with the milk solids removed, you can definitely use that. I just find adding this little bit of butter gives a nice flavor to the soup. Also, adding a little bit of fat to the soup pot helps with the browning of the meat, even though the meat is eventually going to be releasing some of its own fat. Now we're going to go ahead and put in our ground beef right into our melted fat mixed with the olive oil. Now, once you get your ground beef in here, you want to brown this really well. This is a very important tip so that you get a really nice, tasty soup in the end. And what is really helpful about this is when you go to add your liquid, we're going to be using a beef bone broth. You could also use beef broth or beef stock, which we'll talk about in a minute. But if you don't have any of those, don't worry, because by browning this chopped meat or this ground beef really well, you're going to get some nice browning on the bottom of your pot. I believe it's called like fond. And when you deglaze the pan with water, all of those brown bits are going to make a very flavorful broth for you. So that's what's nice. As I said, this is a very flexible recipe. Now, as you're stirring this around, do not try to break this up in very small pieces. That is the whole point of a hamburger soup. You want to give it the appearance of as though you've taken hamburgers and just kind of crumbled them up and thrown them into a soup. So unlike if you're making a chili or a sloppy joe, like in the sloppy joe video that I made, I showed you how I was using the potato masher because you want the texture to be really fine. You do not want that in a hamburger soup. You want this to be a little on the chunky side. Now this will take about 5 to 7 minutes or so to brown up really nicely. Now I'm using a ground beef that's 85% lean and 15% fat. And I really like that mixture because, again, this is grass-fed, grass-finished, so I'm really after that 15% fat that's going to be very high in the CLA. If you want to use a lower percentage of fat with more lean meat in your ground beef, that'll work in this recipe too. Either way, it doesn't really matter. It's very, as I said, very flexible. It's also very forgiving. Well, after about 5 to 7 minutes, you're going to develop some lovely color on the bottom of your pot, and your ground beef should have taken on kind of a nice brownish hue to it and dissipated some of that grayish color that ground beef can have when it's cooked. So this way it looks nice and appetizing, and it has some wonderful flavor. Next, what we're going to do is add in our seasoning. Now, I've got 2 bay leaves here. I'm going to just set those aside and wait till we add in the liquid. But what I've got here is a 1.5 teaspoons of salt and a 1/2 teaspoon of black pepper. And then over here I've got some red pepper flakes. Now, the red pepper flakes are optional. That's if you like things a little spicy, and I've just got 1/4 teaspoon of that. And then over here I have a teaspoon of Italian seasoning. Since hamburger soup has a tomato base to it, the Italian seasoning works out really well. But you could certainly use anything you have on hand if you just want to use oregano or maybe some thyme, something like that. They'll all work very well. If you want to know how to make a homemade Italian seasoning, I have a video where I show you how to make that along with a whole host of other homemade seasoning mixes. And I'll be sure to link to that in the iCards and in the description below. And I'll also put all the links to the various recipes that I mentioned where I have videos and printable recipes. I'll put them in the pinned comment as well, because I know some of you have told me it's a little easier for you to click on things in the pinned comment. So now we're just going to go ahead and put in all of our seasoning. And the reason I don't put this seasoning in ahead of time, you know, along with the raw ground beef, is that the salt particularly, I don't want it to be releasing any liquid. I don't want it to cause the meat to release any liquid. I want to just have that fat in there and get everything browning really nicely. But now we'll go ahead and put in our salt along with the other seasonings. Oh, that Italian seasoning smells really good. That's the fun about home cooking. There's always a lot of lovely aromas. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our onion. And I just have 1 onion here that I've chopped up. This is not an exact science. You can really dice it or make slightly larger, chop pieces, whatever you like, however you want it to appear in your soup. And I had a pretty large onion, but as I said, this is very flexible. Use whatever onion you have. Now I've just dumped in those onions, and I'm just going to spin them around here, stir them around with the ground beef. And then I'm just going to let them cook for a minute or 2, just until they start to soften. Now I want to mention there are so many ways that you can make this hamburger soup. This is one of those recipes that probably every mother, every grandmother, maybe even every great-grandmother has some version of. So I'm going to talk about some options as we get closer to adding things like the potatoes and the vegetables and whatnot. But know that this is very flexible, and you can really add to this anything that you want. Now I like to start mine just with the ground beef and the onions, but some people will make what's known as a mirepoix. It's a mixture of onions, celery, and carrots, and all chopped fairly small, and that makes for a lovely flavoring base. So that's something that you can do as well. Now, if you want to add carrots in as more of a main feature of your hamburger soup as opposed to a seasoning base, and you want to cut your carrots into larger bite-sized pieces, you can definitely do that as well. The only difference is that once we add our potatoes, we're just going to let them saute up a little bit. I'll explain why in a minute, why I use the word saute. And then we're going to add in our liquid, let the potatoes cook a little bit, then go ahead and add in your carrots, because they don't take as long to cook as the potatoes. So that's like one way that you can alter this recipe. I'm not going to be putting in large whole carrots. You're going to see what I do at the end, but that is an option, and it's a nice affordable option, since carrots, potatoes, these are very affordable vegetables, or tubers in the case of the potatoes. But at any event, what I wanted to mention about the potatoes, in the beginning of the video, I mentioned that you can really stretch this recipe to feed a crowd. And if you're wanting to get more than 8 servings out of this, you can definitely go ahead and add more potatoes. I've got the equivalent of about 2 large potatoes. I had a lot of small ones, but I'd say they were about the equivalent of 2 large ones. And I'm using the Yukon Gold that have the very thin yellow skin, and I have peeled them and I've cubed them up into, like healthy, relatively healthy, bite-sized pieces. But you could also use the red-skinned potatoes. You could also use Idaho potatoes, the nice big bakers. They do tend to create a little more creaminess to the soup than these more waxy potatoes. However, that's kind of a nice feature as well. It almost becomes like a little stew-like. But if you prefer more of a broth base to your hamburger soup, then stick with like your Yukon Gold or your red-skinned potatoes. Alrighty, well, the onions have softened up a bit. And now what I'm going to do is just make kind of a little well in the middle, and I'm going to go ahead and add in some garlic. And what I've got here is about 2 cloves of garlic, and I've just mashed it up. I like to mash it up in my mortar and pestle as opposed to chopping it up, but do what's ever convenient for you. And certainly, if garlic doesn't agree with you, you can leave it out. If you really like garlic and you want to add in a little more, I love it. I think you can never have enough garlic, but I don't want to overdo it for my family. So you can definitely, but you can, if you really like it and everybody in your family really likes it, you can definitely add in more. So if you're new to cooking and you might be wondering, gee, can I just put the garlic and the onions in and the ground beef and just go from there? Certainly, yes, you can do that. However, I find that it's more difficult to get the ground beef to brown up because the onions are releasing liquid into the pot, and so you're not getting kind of the nice fond on the bottom as well as you will. You will get some fond, but not as well as you will when you're just browning the beef on its own. Now, could you do the onions and the garlic and then take them out and then put the beef in, strain out any liquid that the onions may release, then put the ground beef in? Yes, you could certainly do it that way too. I just find that a lot of work. And I don't, and I find, some people will ground the ground beef, they'll take that out, drain off any excess fat, but you'll see we really don't have a lot, and the potatoes are going to take care of the rest of it, which we'll talk about in a minute. But and they'll drain off the fat, remove the ground beef, then saute up their onions and their garlic separately. But I actually find once you've browned your ground beef and then you add the onions in to saute with the beef, that it really helps kind of sort of like put the flavor of the onion and the garlic into the beef very nicely. And I think that what happens is it makes for a lovely flavor as you're eating the soup and the ground beef comes into your mouth. It has, and you bite into it, it has a nice kind of a little bit of onion, a little bit of garlic, a little bit of the Italian seasoning. Not overwhelming, but just very pleasant. So that's kind of the reason why I'm doing things in the order that I am. The aroma of that garlic is wonderful too. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to strain out my potatoes. The only reason they're in the water is because I cut them in advance and I didn't want them to brown. But you can just be cutting them on your board and getting them ready to add to your soup. You don't have to necessarily do them in advance. And as I said, you want to stretch this, just add another potato. Now, once I get the potatoes in, I'm just going to mix them up real well with the beef and the onions and all the lovely seasoning. And what happens, I'm not going to add in the liquid right away. I'm just going to let these cook a little bit with the beef and all the seasoning, as well as the little bit of fat that's in the bottom of our pan, or the bottom of our soup pot. And what will happen is the potatoes will absorb a little bit of that fat and become very flavorful, and the potatoes will also, as they're heating, release a little bit of their starches, and that gives a little bit of the body to the soup. And as I said, if you use the Idaho potatoes, they really add a lot of body. But this is just the perfect thing, because I feel this is a wonderful way to make sure that we get that wonderful CLA, or that fat that's high in CLA, to remain in this soup, and so as to make it very nutrient rich or nutrient dense. Well, I've just let these potatoes saute a little bit with the ground beef, and as you'll see, when you pull your meat and potatoes back from the bottom of your pot, you really shouldn't see any fat, or as some people would say, grease, at the bottom of your pan. The potatoes should have absorbed everything quite nicely. Alrighty, now, and that'll take just a minute or two. It's not you're not going to be sauteing them for a long time. Alrighty, now we're going to go ahead and add in our 8 cups of liquid. And as I said, because you've got some nice fond on the bottom of your pan and your ground beef has been browned up beautifully, you don't need to worry if you're just going to use water. What I'm using here is some beef bone broth. But I said if you have just broth or stock, that's all fine too. And if you are wondering what's the difference, because you will hear people say broth, stock, and bone broth, they're actually all different. But let me get this in. We'll start deglazing the bottom of the pan. And as I said, 8 cups. Oh, that's beautiful. And now we just want to bring this up to a simmer. Now, once you get your liquid into your soup pot, just use your spoon or your spatula, whatever you have, and just go back and forth gently on the bottom to help release some of that fond into your liquid. And it's not going to be difficult to do because the liquid hitting the hot pan is going to do a lot of the work for you and start releasing it. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in my bay leaves, and I'm just adding in 2. I love the flavor of bay, and so I'm just going to go ahead and add that. Again, that's totally optional. Now, if you are using bay leaves, you just want to remember to remove them before you serve your soup. And you can use fresh or dried bay leaves. What I'm using are dried bay leaves. I know some of you have asked me sometime when you see the bay leaves that I'm using, oh, are they fresh? They look so green. They just happen to be the ones I have that look very green, but they are dried. But you can use either. I always feel they bring a little brightness, a little freshness to any type of soup. Now I'm just going to bring this up to about maybe a medium simmer. You can certainly bring this up to a full rolling boil if you want. Whenever I use bone broth as my liquid base, I really don't like to go higher than a medium simmer because I don't want to damage the gelatin that's in the bone broth. Now, never worry about that though. If you, as the expression goes, break the gelatin, the bone broth is still nutritious, like if you're making it homemade and it doesn't appear particularly gelatinous when you refrigerate it. Don't worry about that. It's still very nutritious, but it's that gelatin that we really try to, it's that state of being very gelatinous that we try to reach, because it's gelatin that's incredibly nutritious for our digestive tract, as well as our hair and our nails, our skin, everything. But in any event, so I'm just going to bring mine up to about a medium simmer. Certainly can go to a rolling boil. And you're just going to, but I recommend turning it down so nothing bubbles over, to about a medium simmer. And we're going to let those potatoes cook. Really, depending on how large or small you've cut them, it can take, maybe 10, 15 minutes, maybe a little longer if they're particularly large. But you just want to get them to where they're fork or knife tender. Now, while those potatoes are cooking, we'll make our homemade Hamburger Bun Croutons. Oh, and I just wanted to mention, because I get so many questions about this, this is a Cuisinart countertop burner. I've had it a while. I think it works great. I'm very happy with it. And I'll be sure to put a link in the description below if that's something you're interested in learning more about. Now, in a previous video, I showed you how to make homemade hamburger buns, and then we topped them with homemade sloppy joes. They couldn't have been more delicious. But these are very easy to make. I hope you'll give it a try, especially if you're a new baker, because this is part of a series that I'm going to do throughout this year to help you start to learn how to become a home baker. And we just use yeast. It's very easy. I don't make you use sourdough. But over time, as we go throughout the year, I'm going to be moving you into sourdough, and we're even going to bake with some sprouted grains towards the end of the year. So by come December of this year, you're going to be an experienced home baker. But I hope you'll give these hamburger buns a try. It's very easy. I also share with you how to make homemade sandwich bread. These are things that are not difficult. And it's so nice when you make them homemade because the ingredients are very simple compared to the list of ingredients on a sandwich bread or a hamburger bun at the grocery store. Plus, when you learn how to make homemade sandwich bread or you learn how to make homemade hamburger buns, and yes, this same recipe can also be turned into hot dog buns. Many of you had asked me about that. You just shape them a little differently. But once you learn how to make these homemade, you have so much more money in your budget, in your food budget, because these things are very reasonable to make. It doesn't cost you a lot. You've got some flour, some yeast, some water, some salt, and you're good to go. But if right now what you have are store-bought hamburger buns, you can certainly use those to make croutons as well. There's something about hamburger buns that make really nice croutons. Because sometimes if you've ever had croutons and they can really be almost like overly hard or overly crisp. That's not the case when you make them with hamburger buns, and they're perfect for hamburger soup. So we already ate 4, and I have 4 left over. I could certainly put these in the freezer. They freeze beautifully and they defrost beautifully. You'll feel like they were just made that same day that you're going to eat them, even if you had frozen them. But I wanted to show you how to make croutons with them for this recipe. So that's what I'm going to go ahead and do with these. So all you need to do is just slice your hamburger bun in half, and then we're just going to take each half and go ahead and cut it into cubes. And for the hamburger soup, I like a pretty generous size cube. If you hear that popping over on my stovetop, I'll explain that in a minute. Since we've got the soup simmering here on this countertop burner, I'm going to be taking you over to my stovetop when we make these croutons. Now, what I've got in my frying pan over there is some lard. If you've never had croutons fried up in lard, oh my gosh, you don't know what you're missing. It's so delicious. However, if you made the roast duck with me before Christmas, or you made the roast goose with me before Christmas, and now you have some duck fat or some goose fat, it's wonderful too. You can't go wrong with that. And if you also learned how to render lard with me that I showed you how to do, and as I said, I'll link to all these videos, but if you've got some of the lard that you may have rendered with me, that works great too. That's exactly what I'm using. Now I have a full-length video all about how to make croutons, and I show you how it's a really great way to make use of stale bread that you may have in your freezer that you save when you just have an extra slice here and there. And in that video, I show you how to make croutons on the stovetop as well as in the oven. And so that's definitely worth checking out if that's something that you want to learn about in more detail. Today, I'm just going to do them on my stovetop. I really like to make croutons on my stovetop. And it's especially nice during the warm summer months. See, we're in a cold month now, so I could certainly heat up my oven. But it's especially a nice way to learn how to make croutons on the stovetop in the warmer months when you don't feel like turning on your oven. Now, I'm going to keep these croutons very simple. I'm just going to toss them on the stovetop in the melted lard with a little bit of salt and just really a pinch of the Italian seasoning. That will complement the Italian seasoning in the hamburger soup very nicely, but it won't overwhelm either because the hamburger buns have a lovely flavor to them in themselves. Now all I'm going to do is take my hamburger buns and just sort of cut them into 4s, and then I'm going to slice the 4s into a bunch of cubes. Now that I've got my hamburger buns all cubed up, I'm going to go ahead and put those into a frying pan on my stove where the lard is melted. I've put in some salt. I've put in a little Italian seasoning, and I'm just going to toss these around in the frying pan until they become nicely golden brown on the outside with a good crisp crunch. Now I want to mention that frying up croutons in animal fats like lard or duck fat or goose fat is very nutritious because these animal fats are very rich in vitamins and minerals. These animal fats are really nutrient-dense, nutrient-rich foods, just like the beef fat from our ground beef. So croutons are a wonderful way to introduce a lot of good nutrition into your diet as well as that of your family and friends' diet, because normally people might say, oh, I don't know if I want to eat lard, or I don't know if I want to eat goose fat or duck fat or whatever the case may be. They may feel they don't like the taste, or they may have other opinions about it. But the good news is croutons are just so flavorful and so tasty that it almost can become like a little snack food, especially when you make them with sourdough bread. That is something I made throughout my son's childhood. And I would always have a container ready for him to snack on. And I would fry them up sometimes in beef tallow, which is beef fat. And I've showed you how to render beef fat to make tallow, as well as the lard, and also chicken fat, what we call schmaltz. So I've got a lot of videos on all of these various nutrient-dense fats. But I would fry them up sometimes in beef tallow, sometimes in lard, goose fat, duck fat, whatever I had. You can also just do ghee or butter or olive oil. And he would really enjoy snacking on them. And they'd have some herbs. You know, herbs are both medicinal as well as culinary, you know, and they have a lot of wonderful nutrient-rich properties to them, and a little sea salt. And that was a wonderful, delightful snack that had crunch to it. And he never missed a lot of the junk food snacks that you'd see in the junk food aisle. Well, I just removed the croutons from the stovetop, and they look wonderful. Now I'm going to go ahead and set these aside because the potatoes are getting close to done. And something I want to mention, when I was talking about how it'll take maybe 10 to 15 minutes or so for your potatoes to cook, depending on, you know, what size you cut them up to be. You want to cook them, I said, you know, fork tender, or you can put a knife through. Basically, you're looking for them to be almost done, because we do have a few more ingredients to add to the soup pot, which will have the potatoes in the liquid for maybe another minute or two. So if they have the slightest bit of resistance when you go to check them, they're fine. They're going to be all cooked through when you're ready to serve your soup. Now we're going to get ready to add in our tomatoes. And what I've got here is a 28-ounce can of chopped tomatoes. You could also use the whole tomatoes that are in the can and just break them up a bit. Whichever you use, you're going to also want to include the liquid. You can also use home canned tomatoes for this as well. And if you have a little more or a little less than what's actually in a can, a store-bought can of tomatoes, that's fine. Don't worry about it. As I said, it's very forgiving. And I'm using canned tomatoes because I'm all out of my home canned tomatoes. But if you want to learn how to can tomatoes, I have a video where I show you how to do that, and it's definitely directed at the beginner. I walk you through step by step by step. And it's water bath canning, so it's an easy place to start before you move on to pressure canning. Now, I'm going to go ahead and add in my chopped tomatoes. However, some people do like to actually use tomato sauce instead of tomatoes. Using tomato sauce will give your hamburger soup a much more tomato soupy type of consistency. It'll be more like tomato soup, but with different things added into it. That can be very tasty also, but I really prefer it with the tomatoes. It makes it kind of chunky, and then the base of the soup stays a little more brothy, almost if you can imagine like a vegetable beef soup or something like that. And we just prefer it more brothy. But if you want to use tomato sauce, you'd need just one of those average sized jars of tomato sauce at the grocery store. I think they're about 24 ounces, or certainly you can use your homemade tomato sauce. I show you how to make a homemade marinara that would be perfect to use here. So I'm just going to go ahead now and add my tomatoes right in, and all we need to do is just warm this through. Now I'm also going to go ahead and add in a tablespoon of tomato paste. If you're using tomato sauce, you probably don't need this. I find with the chopped tomatoes, this helps give it a nice little bit of a flavor boost and just a slight bit more thickness to the final soup than just a very brothy vegetable soup. It's still, or vegetable beef soup. It's still going to be brothy, but this just adds a little something extra. And when you get all of that in, all your tomato product, just go ahead and give this a good stir, and it's just going to need about a minute or so to heat through. Now I just want to mention something about tomato paste. I really like getting tomato paste in a tube like this. I find it's wonderful. You keep this in your refrigerator, and then you can just measure out whatever amount you need at any time. And I always look for this. This is a little more expensive than the tomato paste in the can, so I always look for this when it's on sale or there's a coupon at my grocery store. However, if you do buy tomato sauce in the can, which I also buy that as well, what you can do is use a can opener to remove the ends of each side of the little can that holds the tomato paste, and then just put it in some sort of freezer-proof container, just a freezer-proof plastic bag, whatever you have. Pop that in your freezer and let it freeze. When it's frozen, bring it out and just give it about a minute or two on your countertop just to soften ever so slightly. Then you can push the tomato paste from one side and it'll come out as a little round cylinder on the other side. And be careful, maybe use some silicone gloves or something, or maybe like the end of a wooden spoon like this. You just want to protect your fingers. You don't want to cut yourself on the rim of where the can was opened in case it's a little bit sharp. But once you get that out, you now have this little cylinder of tomato paste, and you can just slice that up in maybe about 8 pieces and then freeze them, so that they stay individually frozen. If they've softened up a bit, you can just put them on a baking sheet, whatever the case may be. If they're still hard, then you can skip that point, but then you can just go ahead and put them into a freezer-proof plastic bag or container, and whenever you need a tablespoon of tomato paste, you can just take that out and you're all set. Now I just want to mention, if you were using any fresh vegetables, as I mentioned earlier, like the carrots that you would add in, especially if they're cut in a pretty good chunk size, you wanted to add those in a little after the carrots so that everything would cook evenly. And the same if you're using maybe fresh string beans. They take a little less time than the carrots to cook and a little less time than the potatoes to cook. So you can put those in afterwards. But, and basically it's just knowing whatever fresh vegetable you're using, having some idea of how long they take to cook as to when you would put them into your soup. But what I find is just a lot easier to do is to just go ahead and use some frozen vegetables. This, I really feel, can be very much a busy mother's or a busy home cook's little secret. And also, too, the nice thing about hamburger soup, you really use this as a vehicle to hide in some leafy greens and get those into everybody's diet, because they're very, very good for you, very rich in nutrients. We hear about why we should all be eating more leafy greens on a regular basis. So what I've got here is just a 16-ounce package of spinach. And I want to mention, in the printable recipe, I will go over and explain all of the things that I'm talking about during this video, whether you're using fresh vegetables or frozen vegetables, what fresh vegetables you're using, timeline for when to put them in when you're making this, and all of that. But in any event, when you're using frozen vegetables, you're literally just going to put those in at the end. I let them defrost. I just, took them out of their package and rinsed them off, put them in the bowl, and let them, soften. So all they need to do right now is warm through, so they're going to go in at the very last minute. Now what I've got here is a 16-ounce package of a mixture of carrots, corn, and peas. And you can also use canned vegetables. So if you have canned corn or canned peas, this can be a great recipe for hiding canned peas. And no one will know they're canned because they just look like they're cooked. And so that's something to keep in mind. Or peas and carrots often come together in a can. Another great way to rely on using some supplies you may have in your working pantry or your extended pantry, what we sometimes call the prepper pantry. And so that's 16 ounces right there, which the package was 16 ounces and it was already mixed and cut up like that. And then I had a 16-ounce package of frozen chopped spinach. And all I did was let it defrost, and then I gave it a good squeeze in a mesh strainer to just get out all of the liquid, because at this point we really don't need to be adding any more liquid to the soup. But I highly recommend using hamburger soup as a way to get some more greens into your diet or your family's diet. So what we're going to do is, this is the tomatoes all heated through. The potatoes are beautifully cooked. And now we're just going to go ahead and add in our frozen veggies and let this cook. Just not even cook through, basically just warm through. Now this is all warmed through. Took literally like 30 to 60 seconds. And I'm just going to give the broth a taste to see if we need to add any additional salt or pepper. It just looks lovely, and it smells so fragrant. Oh, that's perfect. Alrighty, now let's plate it up and take a taste with everything in it. Well, this just looks lovely. We've got some nice chunks of the ground beef that's been beautifully browned and flavored. You've got the potatoes, the spinach, the tomatoes, and the mixed veggies. It just looks wonderful. Now, over here I also have some flat leaf Italian parsley. If you don't add any greens into your soup, you could certainly chop up some parsley, especially the flat leaf Italian parsley, which is very nicely flavored, and you could sprinkle that on top. Kind of gives it a nice little pop of green, a little bit of freshness, and also added nutrition. And now the piece de resistance, putting a few of these lovely croutons sprinkled on top. They're nice. They start to absorb the wonderfully flavored broth. I think you're going to really enjoy this. Well, I tried to get a little bit of everything on my spoon, including one of those croutons. So let's give this a taste and see how it is. Oh, that's delicious. And I'm telling you, those croutons really add a nice touch. Now, if you'd like more recipes that are budget-friendly and easy to make, be sure to click on this video over here. We have a whole playlist, how to make the sloppy joes, how to make these homemade hamburger buns, as well as lots of recipes that use pantry staples. And I'll see you over there in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.